This conference will now be recorded.
So we welcome you all to ANCAN and to our webinar on the language of cancer. I would ask everybody to mute if you're not talking so we don't get any background noise. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise from somebody right now. So if you can mute. And just a quick word on who we are. ANCAN provides navigation, support, and advocacy really to anybody with chronic condition. We came out of prostate cancer, which was where we tested and tried what we do, and it proved very successful. And as a result, we now have 15 groups a month for various cancers. And as I mentioned just before we started recording, we're about to start a group for multiple sclerosis, and we're hopeful that we will be addressing other conditions too. And if anybody on the call has an interest in moderating a call for their own condition, please reach out to us. Our website is www.ancan.org. I've put that in the chat box for you. One of our groups is a men-only group called Speaking Freely, and the moderator for that group, Rich Jackson, is on this call right now. And that's a group really to talk about any issue that is regarding related to your cancer. And a while back, we had a presentation on the language of cancer that Dr. Wassersug was kind enough to present, and it was a really successful presentation. Howard Walensky was part of it, and we said, you know, we would really like to open this up to more than just the men-only guys that we get regularly on Speaking Freely. And so we decided to, and I should say Jamie Ayton was on that too, excuse me, Jamie. And we decided to open it up to everybody, and that's why we're doing this presentation tonight. So we have four, what should I say, prestigious panel members, prestigious in their own right. And I will introduce, starting with ladies first. First, Dr. Corrie Painter, who's a cancer researcher and part of the Broad Institute, which is comes under the auspices of MIT and Harvard. And Corrie is also has been diagnosed with cancer, and out of her experience came an idea to use patients with the same disease, samples from patients with the same disease to create a database. And out of that, as it grew, there are now 6 different cancers that are being monitored. And we are very familiar with the prostate cancer, metastatic prostate cancer project. Some of you may be familiar with the metastatic breast cancer project. There are more. Corrie is also a research director, is also a director of Count Me In, which is the nonprofit that oversees all of those efforts. And we welcome you, Corrie.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Dr. Richard Wassersug is also a researcher in the social sciences, and before he retired was on the faculty at the University of British Columbia. Richard also lives with cancer and has done a tremendous amount of work for men diagnosed with prostate cancer who are on hormone therapy. Richard and I have been working together on and off now for probably 4 or 5 years, and we are very grateful that he's a member of this panel, and he will be presenting to us shortly to give everybody on the call, in the group, a sort of a basis from which we can have a panel discussion later. Howard Walensky is a medical journalist who wrote a very interesting and provocative article on whether he himself is a cancer survivor, since he has a very low grade of cancer, and has some very interesting opinions on that. And we welcome Howard from Chicago. And then finally, Dr. Jamie Ayton is a professor at Wheaton College, and his particular field of interest is disaster management, crisis management. And he is also a stage 4 colorectal cancer. He's living with stage 4 colorectal cancer. I don't want to use the S word, Jamie. So, because it's too controversial. So I have to be careful how I phrase my language. So, and Jamie recently wrote a terrific article. Some of you may have seen it. It's linked on our website, that was published in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And that's how we first came to meet, and we've talked a little bit, and we're also doing some other things. But hopefully we're going to be creating a colorectal cancer virtual group. So now I've introduced the panel. Before I turn over to Dr. Wasserseug to present, I just want to tell you, if you have questions, please put them in the chat window. We will be monitoring that. If you're on the telephone, then you can download Richard's presentation on our website, on the webinar website. And also, if you have a question, send it to Len, L-E-N, at ancan.org, len at ancan.org. And just a quick acknowledgement to Len Sierra, who's my co-moderator, who will be handling the questions, and to Jake Hannum, my other co-moderator, who will be handling the technical side of GoToMeeting. And with that, we have made you presenter. Professor, you are up.
Okay, now I can hear myself. Let me see if my slides are showing up. Do you see my slides? That's a question.
No, we could before, but we can't see them yet. But I think you have to share your screen. There you go. Yes, perfect. Okay. And there you go.
There we go.
Absolutely perfect.
Well, thank you all for being here. Let me clarify a couple things to make sure that everyone understands I'm a research scientist with a PhD. I'm not an MD, although I've been honored to be called doctor. I still retain a honorary professorship at UBC, but I spend most of my life as a professor of anatomy and neurobiology at the other end of Canada. I'm going to take about 20 minutes, and I've picked a few terms. Let me start off by saying right off the top that the word string, you just put in quotes, language of cancer into Google, you get over 1 million hits. So this collection of 3 words, language of cancer, has gotten a lot of attention. Clearly, many people have thought about this language and have written about it. Some of them are on this panel with me right now. Now, there are many words and phrases, many, that one could comment on, lots of them. Here I will focus on a small selection of terms that have psychosocial implications, and how they are understood can variously help or hurt people. And we'll have some examples of that in the next few minutes. And this will be just a small fraction of the terms that one could explore or discuss about. So here are a few terms that can be problematic because of how people understand or misunderstand them. And this is, as I say, is just a subsample of the terms we could discuss, and maybe many more will come up in the next hour or so. The word cancer itself, I will indicate a couple of concerns I have with that. Survivor, that was already sort of alluded to in the introduction, and whether one considers himself a survivor, they've just been diagnosed, treated or whether they have evidence of cured or not. This varies a lot in how people understand this term. A fighter or warrior. So we have the language of a war on cancer. In fact, it starts with the Richard Nixon presidency over a half century ago, where he declared a war on cancer. And we've been fighting that so-called war for 50 years and haven't won it. So this may be a language issue, and we'll come back to that. Palliative care and hospice. These are heavy terms that people have different attitudes towards. We'll touch upon those. Patient is one that I'm particularly interested in because I'm concerned about how cancer treatments affect not just patients, but the people they're closest to. So we can talk about patient and partner versus patient and caregiver. And often you hear a lot about that person being a caregiver for cancer patients, and I will come back to that. If we have time, I'll bring up 3 different, very similar sounding terms, but actually mean something quite different. Patient-centered care, person-centered care, and relationship-centered care. And if we have some time and well at the end, I might point out that one often talks about someone being a patient advocate, a patient representative, or a patient advisor. And I'm going to suggest that these terms all have subtle and significantly different meanings. Okay, the word cancer. Let's start there. Obviously a good one to start with. The fact that I think most everyone in this panel knows is that there is no single disease called cancer. Rather, there are many diseases called cancer, and they are not equally dangerous. We too often fail to distinguish dangerous cancers from curable cancers. This has some implications when we get to the word survival, which I'll bring up again. But not making this distinction, as not distinguishing cancers which have like a 95 or higher percent cure rate versus those that have a 90% non-cure rate, cancer societies, such as the American Cancer Society, help promote the idea that one should be equally anxious about all cancers. And this is a promoting strategy, because if they can keep the level of anxiety amongst us, the public, high, they can raise more money. So here's a paradox. They're trying to reduce our anxiety by finding a cure, but at the same time, they can raise the money to find a cure by keeping us anxious right now. One could argue, however, that this imprecision of language by not distinguishing one cancer from another is unethical, and I will make a claim, just for the sake of discussion here, that the American Cancer Society would be more honest. It would be if it were called the American Cancer Society, and I would argue we could campaign for that. So how do we change the situation? How do we get people to start to use the term of cancers? And there's been a fair bit of literature on this, actually. Several authors have blamed the healthcare providers, the doctors and the nurses and so forth, for not doing enough to educate patients that not all cancers are the same. But a case can be made that the problem lies mostly with the media. Now, in fact, I mean, just because your doctor says to you, your cancer is an easy one, there's a very, very high cure rate, it doesn't change the perception the public has at large. So here is an argument of just, again, throwing it out for discussion, but we could start by pushing journalists to be more accurate when they report on famous people diagnosed with or dying of cancer. So they may say, so-and-so was just diagnosed with cancer, and we might suggest that we might campaign right back. What do you mean? There's no disease called cancer. What are you talking about? And push the journalist to help educate the public that they're not all one disease. The word survivor, that has already come up, and I've written a little bit on this. And the fact is that some patients love the term, others hate it. So I'm on a Dragon Boat team. We're a mixed team at this time of year, breast cancer, prostate cancer patients, and the statistics in this show that the breast cancer community loves the term survivor, and the prostate cancer patients do not. For some patients, surviving is trivial. For others, it is a miracle. And this actually relates to sort of a paradox. At two extremes, you don't hear a lot of people who have been diagnosed with a cancer calling themselves survivors. So those who have a small, easily localized squamous cell carcinoma, common skin cancer that's easily treated, they typically don't think of themselves as a survivor because it's so easy to diagnose and treat. At the other extreme, you have pancreatic patients who know that the disease has a very low survival rate. They don't walk around calling themselves survivors. So somewhere in the middle, we have people who do like the term to use it to some extent. For many, the term implies that one is cured. So for instance, in prostate cancer, I'm a prostate cancer patient, we have to get blood tests regularly to see whether our cancers come back or not. And it's been said that the only way you know whether you've been cured of prostate cancer is to die of something else. So prostate cancer is not easily defined as cured, and consequently, you'll find prostate cancer survivors liking the term. While treatments for some cancers are clustered together, other treatments are offered to patients in a more incremental fashion as the disease progresses. So let me unpack that sentence. One of the factors which I'm going to suggest relates to whether one considers themselves a survivor or not is whether they are treated with a massive blast of treatments, or whether they're treated slowly. If one treatment works, that's it. If that doesn't work, they go on to another one and another one and another one. Breast cancer patients are often treated with multimodal treatments. They can be surgery, radiation, and chemo over a short period of time. And if they survive that and they're clear for 5 years, they can fairly well feel that they have been cured and they are survivors. With the prostate world, you get one treatment. If it doesn't work, then 5, 6, 8, 10 years later, you might go on to another one. And again, 5, 6, 8, 10 years later, you might go on to a third one and so forth. So in one case, one has an acute treatment and they view themselves as a survivor. One where you have a disease that you're treating chronically, you may feel less like calling yourself a survivor. Patients who are treated with intense multimodal therapies given over a relatively short time and have no further disease progression are likely to the ones who are the ones who are most likely to like the term survivor. Breast cancer patients, as I already pointed out, generally like this term. Prostate cancer patients commonly do not. Moving on, from the word survivor comes the issue of fighting, because you fight wars and you see whether your side survives or not. So there's a huge issue around the war language in cancer. And it goes back to at least Richard Nixon. There's a problem, however, with this. And I co-authored an editorial article some years ago with David Hauser here, cited at the bottom. And he's done some really nice work, and I give him the credit for this. He's examined how people respond to scenarios where they're viewed as fighting a disease versus a disease where they're trying to regain a balance in their lives. So one is sort of a Western world and one's an Oriental world view, but he doesn't dig into that. Rather, he explores what it means to think of yourself as in a battle, in a war, when you're facing a disease like, say, a cancer. There is no evidence, and this is an important part, you hear this language all over and over again, so-and-so lost their battle with cancer, they lost their fight. There's no evidence that the military metaphor extends life or improves quality of life. And I'd probably underline that or put it in bold if I were to set up these slides again. This is intriguing, and here's the issue. Instead, it is associated with fatalism. It is all-encompassing and takes away from living one's life. So what David Hauser did is he did a study where he presented scenarios and he showed that fatalism sets in. If this sounds a little obscure, think about the situation of the soldiers on the battlefield, say in World War II. They may have known that smoking was not particularly helpful. They may have just thought before that they're never going to smoke, but there they are in the trenches in a war, and someone offers them a cigarette, and they figure, well, I could die any minute. I might as well just have a cigarette. And so the fatalism can actually be dangerous. We know that for our benefit and health as cancer patients, it's better to not worry every minute about whether you're at war and whether you're going to survive the next day, but to keep on living. And it turns out the military metaphor actually impedes living one's life, leads to fatalism where people make less healthy decisions about their lives. And really, that's all David Hauser's work, but I think it's intriguing and important work. And we only wrote the editorial, but he has a whole doctoral thesis built around that. So here's some examples, though, of the war metaphor. And I'm pulling these from prostate cancer. And this is an image used to promote the dog tag campaign. Well, it turns out there's been several dog tag campaigns designed to emphasize, as it says at the bottom there, a commitment to fight cancer. And the soldier's facial expression is meant to convey the seriousness of the moment and thus the seriousness of the disease. So with that emotional message, there have been two actual, at least I know there may have been more, dog tag campaigns. And you join these societies, you make a contribution, you get to wear a dog tag. The top one says, I'm helping win the war against prostate cancer. And it's www, I think it's Calgary Prostate Cancer Network. The other one is Veteran in the War Against Prostate Cancer. These are images of dog tags. Well, if you know anything about dog tags, they were worn by soldiers so that if their body was found in the field, they could take one away to know that the person had died, and they could leave one with a body for proper burial. This was hardly a winning statement about cancer, but nevertheless it has caught on because perhaps people don't know what dog tags are anymore. None of these campaigns actually been very effective, and I'm actually pleased to hear that because I think they are fatalistic, and I don't think they have been shown to be in any way therapeutic. All right, so let's say we go, you can see sort of a progression here from having the word cancer and a diagnosis to terms like survivor to warrior to fighting, and what happens if you then find that your treatments are not necessarily curative, or that you no longer have options that are curative. And then we talk about palliative care. So these terms, unfortunately, are linked to the warrior mindset. To accept hospice is seen by those who believe that cancer must be fought as surrendering to the enemy. And this is a problem because we know that palliative care in many cases can actually extend life, make life better. But if you're convinced that you can't give up, and palliative care means surrendering, or hospices means surrendering, then you may be less likely to use these potential treatment modalities. We are all mortal, and death is unavoidable. Hospice requires accepting mortality, and this is not the same as giving up on life. Palliation is simply a symptom management, and it includes pain management. The common drug treatment for prostate cancer is androgen deprivation therapy, so my research is in that area. It is technically, because it is non-curative, a palliative treatment. Your patients can be on and off of androgen deprivation therapy for years, even for decades. So palliative does not mean that you're going to die, but it does mean that you're concentrating on treatments that are directed at the symptoms and not necessarily a curative for the cancer. Hospice, and this is intriguing, more and more work has been done around the benefits of hospice. It would be more acceptable, though, if it came with life goals. So this is the problem. One of the reasons I think that we don't accept hospice is it's seen as giving up to the enemy when you are fighting a war with cancer and you accept that sort of war metaphor. Another problem is when he doesn't have necessarily goals for hospice. So I'll throw a personal one. I didn't write it in the slides here, but I've never written poetry. My father never wrote poetry when he was a writer, and in his old age, after the age of 90, he started writing poetry. So I vow that I shall take up writing poetry when I go into hospice, but not before then. And there you go. You can have a goal for hospice. My father lived to 98 years old. For terminal breast cancer, and this is an important key point, patients, I quote here, patients with longer admission to hospice, greater than 3 days, reported higher quality of life, and their caregivers were significantly less likely to experience major depressive disorders after the loved one's death. So the person who vows that they're going to fight cancer to the very end doesn't make life good for themselves or for those around them. The person who says, no, I'm mortal, I'm going to die sometime, I'm going to go into managing my symptoms, and I accept hospice actually will have a better life. And in fact, for certain cancers, they've actually shown that it can extend life by the acceptance and not the brutality of some of the more critical and stressful treatments that can come at the end of life. And there's a citation there at the bottom to deal with that point. Going on to some more terms, patient, caregiver. You hear that often, a patient and caregiver. To be a caregiver is honorable in our society as it demonstrates a willingness to sacrifice oneself for someone else. But the title caregiver can be much more of a burden than a blessing. Research shows that having a partner improves survival, and thus patient-partner partnerships should be protected. So this is a personal language theme here of my own. I beg everyone who's in the cancer world, patients, clinicians, MDs, researchers, whatever, is to talk about patients and partners whenever possible, and not just simply use the term patient and caregiver in a way that may not be critical in terms of thinking about what the terms mean. A first step to protecting these relationships is to keep partners as partners and not let the relationship devolve into a patient-caregiver relationship. Some further points on the concept of caregiver. Ethicists, I've read this, have pointed out that sex between a patient and a caregiver, now that caregiver they're thinking of as a clinician perhaps, but they could be the partner. The sex between a patient and a caregiver is unethical because it is not an even dynamic. But to label someone a caregiver of a cancer patient implies that their sexual relationship is over. Because of a mortality, is it admittedly unavoidable that many relationships will end up in a patient and caregiver dynamic. So if you have a co-supportive relationship, both patient and partner, they can both be caring about each other. Clearly, as we get older, if we're partnered, us, the patients, or our partners may end up being a caregiver for the other person. And that's unavoidable and realistic. But until then, we really should be trying to keep them equally supportive, being as a partnership. And I would argue we should resist that language, patient and caregiver, and avoid the label caregiver until it is absolutely necessary, when the relationship can no longer be a co-supportive partnership. Now, there's a need for keeping partnerships strong, as that benefits to everybody. For 5 cancers, and this when I give talks on cancer, a version of the slide shows up in every one. For 5 cancers, prostate, breast, colorectal, esophageal, head and neck, the survival benefit associated with marriage has been reported to be larger than the survival benefit of chemotherapy. Given that fact, cancer centers might improve their outcome by offering a little less chemo and offering instead dating services and marriage counseling. Now, I can't prove that, that's a little glib, but in fact, helping to keep partners as partnership has an enormous amount of survival value for all of these cancers, compared to, say, chemo. So there's something to be said for being attentive to the needs of both the partner and the patient and trying to keep them co-supportive. All right, moving right on along here. I know I have just a few minutes. Patient-centered, person-centered, relationship-centered. You hear the first terms often: patient-centered and person-centered care. And the third term is in the medical literature, and there's a couple hundred papers that mention it at this point, but you don't hear it very often. These terms are not exactly the same, and I would argue that it does matter where I say there, but doesn't matter. It is not clear what the opposite of person-centered care is. So you hear this oftentimes: we need more person-centered care. But what does it mean? If it is not clear what it is. So if we don't know what the opposite of person-centered care is, we don't actually know what person-centered care is itself. At a superficial level, one assumes that patient-centered care or person-centered care involves direct eye contact between the caregiver and the patient, rather than, for instance, the healthcare provider looking at a computer screen or lab reports. So you often hear this: I went to see the doctor and all he did was look at the computer screen, or all he did was look at his blood pressure monitor. He never looked at me. And how bad or good that is really depends on what was on the monitor and what was on the person's face. And it's a valid criticism to some extent. However, the term patient-centered care and person-centered care, I would argue, are somewhat gendered, which is not something I've read or heard before, but I'll raise that point for further discussion. But what I mean by that is that women are better at reading emotions from body language and facial expression, and that's been studied by cognitive psychologists and so forth. And women beat men significantly in being able to read facial expressions accurately. Female patients may expect more eye contact and attention to body language than male patients because it carries more meaning for them. So it's interesting where I've seen centers, and we have one in Canada here to promote person-centered or patient-centered care. The staff at and that program are all women. Females may expect more eye contact and they may read it better, so it may carry more meaning for them. Technical advances in medicine mean more quantitative data for doctors to interpret, and males tend to be more quantitative data. So you find that women enjoy often going to a female doctor because the female doctor looks at them. They may go to a male doctor who's reading all those blood tests and scan results and so forth. I would argue that there's benefit in both. That is, the male approach and female approach should be respected. There is different skill sets. They can be complementary, and often doctors work in groups with males and females. I think that often benefits patients. It would help everyone in the healthcare system if everyone understood the stereotypic areas where men and women are more likely to excel. And these are stereotypes, I admit, but there's a fairly good evidence that they're valid, and that doesn't rank order males or females as better or worse than each other. It says that they have different cognitive skills that can be complementary. And if one understands that, then one can benefit from appreciating both skill sets. Okay, now person-centered care is even a broadening from the patient-centered care. So this is the idea that we're not just concerned about the patient, but we're concerned about their family and so forth. I find the term gets used, but doesn't actually get into practice as often as it should. Otherwise, we'd have more people talking about patients and their partners, and less people talking about patients and caregivers. They would be more concerned about the dynamics. And in that regard, relationship-centered care is a better term. And if people like these terms, patient-centered, person-centered, and so forth, these centered terms, I would say the one to fight for is relationship-centered care. It implies a working relationship between the patient and the healthcare provider. The equality associated with this concept can make life better for both patients and their healthcare providers. So whenever I hear someone promoting person-centered or patient-centered care. I say, look, let's talk about relationship-centered care, because I think that's a better term. And I'm getting near my terminal, my end of my talk here, because I know I should be staying as close to 20 minutes as I can. You hear the terms, and I think some of the people on this call, many of us on the panel, are essentially patient representatives, patient advisors, or patient advocates. And these terms are often thrown out as if they mean the same thing. They do not necessarily mean the same thing. Healthcare organizations and non-governmental charities, such as cancer societies and so forth, increasingly include patients with these titles on their boards, panels, and ethics committees. So how should we and they, these panels and boards and societies and organizations, determine who is qualified to be an advisor, an advocate, or representative for other cancer patients? And this is crucial because I sit nationally on our clinical trials program for Canada, and there are representatives for various cancers who somehow feel, I think occasionally, that because they have a cancer, they can represent all other patients with that cancer. And I don't feel that most of us, including myself, have the knowledge to do that without a lot of work and a lot of effort to hear from other patients. All right, so I think these terms, I have some thoughts on how to make these terms effective. Patient representatives, and many of us on this call, I think, would call ourselves that. We cannot rely on our experience alone to be considered representatives of patients. We really do have to have an attention to other people with the disease. Here, online chat groups and online programs like we're on right now with ANCAN can be very helpful to hear the voice of other patients. And I think one needs to hear a lot of them before one can feel qualified to be a patient representative to a broad cancer care hospital program or whatever. Patient advisors. If you're going to be an advisor, you should be able to give useful advice and not just the personal opinion. So again, where I've sat in such roles, I have struggled to make sure that I know what a whole bunch of other patients think before I come forward with an opinion, make sure that it isn't just my own opinion. The interesting one is patient advocate. That one is probably the most popular term, but there's a subtle issue with the language. To say that a patient advocate is necessary is to say that the healthcare system is not good enough at taking care of the patient. So we talk about an advocate. He is an advocate for the blind. He is an advocate for the indigenous people. He's an advocate for immigrants or whatever. It implies that the population that needs advocacy cannot advocate for itself. And thus the term is implicitly aggressive. The term is implicitly aggressive and confrontational. And that may undermine the ability of a person with this title to provide the best advice. So advocates should realize that the term implies that they're representing the underprivileged, underadvantaged, which can be true in many cases. But in other cases, particularly when patients are put on boards and panels with healthcare providers directly, to be the advocate.
Good stuff.
Okay. So I want to thank a whole bunch of people. It's on my slide here. And I'm listening. I want to thank you. There's my email address if people have questions. And Rick, how are we doing time-wise?
That's terrific. A lot of provocative information. I think we may even have lost one person along the way. Rather than losing them, I think it would be better if they sent us some questions to challenge what you say, so at least we can get some sort of a dialogue going. What I'd like to do now is allow each of the panel members, the 3 panel members who haven't had a chance yet to express their own views, to chime in and to talk about both what Howard might have said and what their own opinions are. And, take 5 to 10 minutes or so. And then at the end of that, we'll answer questions. And we encourage all of you to put your questions in the chat box, or, as I said, to send them to len@ancan.org. So what we'll do is we'll start with Jamie, we'll go to Kari, and we'll finish with Howard. Jamie, you're up.
All right. Well, I just want to say thank you, Richard, for all the great information, such thought-provoking ideas to start off our conversation. Really appreciate that. As I was thinking about this panel and just thinking about some other conversations I've had with others who have been impacted by cancer, as well as I think about my own experience over the last 6 years from being diagnosed with stage 4 colorectal cancer at 35 to now being 5 years, no evidence of disease, just thinking about how important language is. One of the other things that I kind of have been thinking about is also drawing from my experience as both a psychologist that specializes in disasters and trauma. And I think some of the debate that is happening in our community about, do we use fight language or not fight language? Do we use survivor or not survivor? I think that disagreement is actually a good thing. And by that, what I mean is that it tells us that we've not quite found the right terminology yet. And I think it also sparks this idea that we actually need more ways of talking about our experience, not fewer ways of talking about our experience. As a psychologist, I remember when I was first in graduate school and somebody was talking and debating about, when somebody goes through a trauma, do we say survivor or victim? And I remember thinking like, oh, this feels like an argument over semantics. And though once I went through Hurricane Katrina myself and really saw the difference about how powerful our language is, and our language helps us make meaning of our experience. So our words really matter. But at the same time, I think that we need to have both a greater clarity of having both a better professional nomenclature or professional language, but we also need to have equal respect for lay language and to really learn how to ultimately communicate with one another across being a healthcare provider and maybe being the person who's receiving healthcare. So with that being said, one of the things that comes to mind for me is if I'm out working in a disaster zone and the survivor that I'm talking with tells me that they have depression, that could mean a lot of different things, right? Or they might say, instead of depression, they might say, I'm feeling blue, or I feel like I'm in a pit, or I feel like I'm in a fight that I can't win. And all of those may be valid descriptors of clinical or of a major clinical depressive episode. Now, if I talk to another psychologist in the disaster field and I say, this person that I met and have been working with that I want to refer to you has depression, we both automatically know what we're talking about, that there's a set criteria of diagnoses and a scientific way of understanding it as healthcare providers. But again, that's not more valid than the lay version, that we need both of those ways of talking about our experience. So my hope is that rather than us dividing and trying to settle on only one phrase or one word of how we describe our experience, we need to be more open. Think about the last time, all of us on this panel have probably been to a healthcare provider recently, and you've got the little survey that they always hand you, right after they ask for payment or your insurance card, right? But there's always the little survey of, what's your age? And that's pretty matter of fact. I'm 41 years of age. There's no debating that. But then when it gets into other parts of describing who I am, such as my culture, sexual orientation, all of these different aspects that makes us up who we are, it comes down oftentimes to our identities. And I think we need to be moving in a direction within the cancer community and healthcare community to be able to give those who are receiving treatment them the opportunity to define their own experience or provide them some helpful language. Rick, you and I have had multiple conversations where almost every time that you and I talk, I'm like, wait, what was that term you used? And I get excited because suddenly I have a new way of understanding, like, oh, that's my experience, but I never had words to describe it. So we do need to put out words and put out ways of talking about it, but we need to do so with greater flexibility.
Thank you so much, Jamie.
Rick, can I offer some some response to that? There's an irony, actually. In a longer version of this talk, I have the concept of PROs, which stands for patient-reported outcomes, and how they're used and how the term itself of patient-reported outcomes gets variously understood by both healthcare providers and patients in different ways. But the overall things you said, Jamie, I absolutely agree with, and that's why I started with the fact that we have to appreciate how diverse cancer is in terms of then it's not all one disease. Well, it has a long trajectory, and it is very, very variable. So to appreciate the variability in the language is exactly what you said. And it starts, I think, with the fact that it's buried because we don't make the distinction between one type of cancer and another. If we started there, I think all the other points that you raised about being sensitive to the subtleties of the patient and the patient's situation would be at least a little more out in the open. So I agree with you.
Kari, there's been a lot of stuff thrown out, and I've been watching you, and it's like all churning in there, and you've been so good. Now's your chance to tell us what you think and how the language has affected you and the people you work with.
Sure. I guess I need to preface this with saying that I was diagnosed with an exceedingly rare and very aggressive cancer called angiosarcoma that only impacts about 300 people per year. When I was diagnosed, I didn't find any support at all. In person, there was nobody I could turn to. There were no virtual support groups. There was no in-person support groups. But there was one group online on Facebook that everybody kind of funneled toward. And for many, many years, I was lucky enough to survive. And I went through my experience with cancer really relying on a handful of other patients who also only had us. And so we were like this tiny silo of patients kind of treading along, totally unaware that there was this greater world of advocacy or other people experiencing cancer in a much more broad and interconnected way. And in that support group, war analogies were rampant. Everybody was in a fight. Every single one of us was fighting for our lives. And that is just the way we went about everything without a second's thought. I used to blog. I had a blog called The Little Drummer Boy. You know, I felt like every time somebody died, somebody else had to pick up the drum and keep going along. So it was really baked into our teeny tiny little culture. And then I took this position where I do a lot of talking with cancer patients that have a variety of different cancers, the majority of whom have metastatic breast cancer. And I came to realize rather quickly that terminally ill breast cancer patients have almost universal disdain for the word, any of the war analogies. And rather than me trying to use, summarize what some of these patients feel, I thought that I would read the words of one of my metastatic friends, Dr. Kelly Shanahan. I put this out on Twitter yesterday to get some responses about what other people's thoughts were. And this was her reply, which I think probably speaks volumes to the experiences of a lot of people with metastatic breast cancer. The battle language inherently implies winners and losers. It implies that those who die maybe didn't fight hard enough. When metastatic breast cancer kills, I will not be a loser. Cancer is a thief who steals hopes and dreams and childhood innocence and life. And so these people that I know have given quite a bit of thought and put a lot of effort into debunking the notion that any kind of war analogy could and should be used. And I am in total agreement with them in every way, except for when I think of all of my friends with angiosarcoma who have already died and used all of the war analogies to the last moment of their life. And it's really infused with their legacy. And so I think when I reflect on everything that's been said in the panel and on my own personal experiences and on the experiences of those who I rely on every day to kind of guide where we go with our research projects, the thing that I focus the most on is that we should be able to describe our personal experiences with our own words, but other people should not necessarily be attributing anything controversial to us. And it's very clear, I think, that war analogies, the war on cancer, losing the battle, that they fought with dignity, all of these things, when other people attribute it to us, that's where I think one of the main things that we could come together to resolve should focus on. That's all.
Very quick response. I love everything you just said. And you might ask me, so if I'm opposed to the war metaphors, what do I say to someone who says to me, I'm determined to fight this disease? I don't say you shouldn't. I say, well, you also have to keep on living. and what are you doing to live? So I never deny or never argue with someone over their language. I just want to know what it means to them and make sure they understand what it means to them. And so I'm very, Corey, I look forward to meeting in person someday. Thank you.
Corey, I just want to say I so agree with you. I mean, for me, the language that we choose to use has to sit well with us. We who are living with whatever the condition is have to be most comfortable with the language that we use. And if some people are comfortable with the military language, whilst others are not comfortable with the military language, let them choose that language which makes them feel the most comfortable, and have enough tolerance to understand that when other people use language you don't like, it's about them, it's not about you. And I'm just very empathetic to that argument. Howard, you are a man of words as a journalist. So how you select your words is a challenge that you have lived with since you were in journalism school. And if I'm not mistaken, you still teach journalism at Northwestern. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your feelings about these words?
Well, first on the war analogy, I don't know, back when I was 26 years old and facing down Nixon and his war in Vietnam, I was a would-be conscientious objector. My draft board had other ideas for me, and so I refused to go. I was a conscientious objector. I was a war resistor back in the 60s and 70s. And so years have passed now. I'm an old guy with prostate cancer. And I've taken the position that I am a conscientious objector against the war on cancer. I don't like language. I resisted it during Vietnam, and I'm resisting it during the war on cancer. Now, the whole thing, I wrote something for MedPage Today. I do a column for them. And this one was triggered by something that happened to me. I wrote about the language of cancer. I was involved with the group, and I was working with the guy writing up some language for a website. I suddenly realized that we had yet another disagreement. He referred to us as the survivors, cancer survivors. And I said, why are you considering me cancer survivor? I don't consider myself a survivor. I don't like the word. Rather than, the thing that put me off about survivor, part of it is the war analogy, but there's other aspects to it. Survivor seems like kind of a neat, most negative word, and I know from the research I had done that it was an improvement, because they used to call people such as us cancer victims. So back in the mid-'80s, we moved up to being survivors, and it became the official language of the American Cancer Singular Society, the National Cancer Institute, although I suppose that would be the National Cancers Institute if we go on with Richard. So, I didn't like it. I went into researching and writing this, that I was a little pissed off with this guy, assuming I wanted to be called a survivor in this thing we were working on together. And, after I sort of went through the process myself, I read what other people had written about it, including Richard. I came to the conclusion that a couple of you had already hinted at. Jamie was talking about flexibility in your language. Corey and Richard were talking about, pick your own language in effect, but let other people pick their own. I kind of, reach my peace in letting this other fellow, we had a falling out on a number of things, and I don't know what he did in the end, just on a one-on-one basis. I stopped arguing with him. If he wants to consider himself a survivor, then let him be one. If I want to just be a man with prostate cancer, then let me be that, and don't call me a survivor. That's about it.
Well, what I'd like to do now is I have a couple of questions, but Len, do you have any questions that have come in from the audience? I know there's been a lot of comment in the chat window. I'm not so sure there have been sort of questions per se. I've been monitoring that, but Len, do we have any specific questions that people want to ask?
No, as you stated, Rick, people are commenting in the chat box, but no one is actually formulating a question there for us. You did send a pre-meeting question to me from someone, which I'll read now. I want to know what people think I should be called if not a survivor after fighting and beating cancer for almost 10 years.
Richard?
I have to turn my mic on. Yeah. So what's intriguing and paradoxical is that more and more we're getting better at diagnosing cancer before the cancer is symptomatic. And then, and Howard and I, as prostate cancer patients, and I don't know whether Corey, Jamie, this may fit less so. But if you were never symptomatic from your cancer, but you were brutalized by your treatment, then it isn't really that you were a cancer survivor, you were a cancer treatment survivor. And I often prefer that language. And when in discussions like we're having here, what you can do, I consider myself a cancer survivor. My answer is I consider myself a cancer treatment survivor. And in that sense, I'm with Howard because he is in what's called active surveillance. He's had to deal with the brutality of diagnostics. So he's a cancer diagnostics survivor, I suppose.
Say I'm a biopsy survivor.
What's that? I didn't hear that.
He said he's a biopsy survivor.
Yeah, right, exactly, same idea. So there's a bit of a paradox. If we can diagnose cancer so early that they're asymptomatic and the brutality is from the treatment. And that's somewhat important to have people understand what the differences are of the disease versus the treatment. So that would be my answer. That is, you survive the brutality put upon your body if it is solely from that, and otherwise it can be from the cancer itself, of course, and that is terrible as well. But I prefer specificity in language in this area.
I agree. I have to say, I'm reading one of the comments from the chat box from Bill Franklin, who talks about being referred to as a cancer survivor who was also a war veteran. And it was a clear distinction for him to emphatically say, yes, he survived the war, and that those things that threatened his life throughout the war will never threaten him again. However, when somebody talked about his prostate cancer, his reply was, so far. And I think that's how I feel too. Like, yeah, so far I'm alive today, but who knows? Who knows what's lurking? Who knows if it'll come back? And then will I be a survivor if I'm in hospice? Like, when do I stop becoming a survivor? Am I a survivor until the day I die? And it's just a word and piece of language that I think has a lot of weight to it that I've never felt comfortable saying. I usually say when somebody, instead of, I guess, I use more of the term that I'm currently without evidence of disease from my cancer. It's a long chunk of words, but I use that rather than saying that I'm a survivor.
So I have a question for you, Corey, because when we were formulating the little bio for you, I said that you were living with cancer, and you asked me to change that to I was diagnosed with cancer. But when we talked before, we've talked twice today because we had two completely separate meetings. But in one of those meetings, you said something very interesting to me, which was the fact that you have this cancer and you don't know it could come back aggressively, right? So to me, you are living with the cancer. It isn't affecting you. And that's my situation. I mean, I was diagnosed T3 and I was treated, and my cancer seems to be in a durable remission. That we haven't talked about those words, durable or remission or what have you. But I live with the cancer, but it doesn't concern me. Why did you not like those words, living with cancer?
I don't know that there's any malignant cells in my body.
I don't either.
So if you know, for me to say that I'm living with cancer, it almost feels to me, I also may be shaded by the fact that the vast majority of people I work with are metastatic, and when you're metastatic, you're in constant treatment. And I'm not in treatment right now. So what am I really living with? I'm living with the fear of recurrence. Not necessarily, you know, what I see when I talk with my friends who are in active treatment and living with cancer. It almost feels like it's something that is reserved for people that are feeling the ramifications of their cancer, rather than something that's just presenting kind of a nucleus of fear that's ever present.
Jamie, how do you describe yourself?
Yeah, you know, that's been an evolving process for me on a personal level, and sometimes even a day-to-day level. You know, so, you know, I was kind of thinking here, you know, Corey, as you were talking about that experience of where you're at with things and how you think about describing yourself, that really resonated with me, you know, because there were times when I was going through treatment, I would have never called myself a survivor. I would have said I was surviving, right? Or that I was somebody who was diagnosed or a cancer patient. And for me, a lot of this comes from my disaster kind of psychology, you know, background and experiences where, like, for instance, even when I personally had Katrina happen, you know, when Katrina went over our community, when it passed, then everybody who was still alive was a survivor, right? And that was the matter of, it was within minutes that it went through our community. But then, like with cancer, I felt like when I was going through my treatments and not sure about, you know, how effective they were being, I felt it was like having a hurricane hovering over me for a full year. And then even now, even that I'm 5 years, no evidence of disease, I still have those moments where, you know, just a couple of days ago, I had kind of a pain in my back and then one in my leg, and all of a sudden I was like, oh wait, that's what happened right before I found out I'd had where the tumor spread and was hitting a nerve, and I thought it was back pain initially, when actually it was cancer that was spreading in my body. And so there's still a bit of that living with it. So for me now, I kind of think of oftentimes that I'm more in this kind of survivorship phase, but not meaning that I'm out of the woods, because as a researcher, statistically, I don't like my statistics when I look at, you know, prognoses and everything else for somebody at my age who had my diagnosis at my staging. But yeah, so just all that to say that, you know, I think it's okay for it to sometimes fluctuate even with how we experience it. And in some ways too, I think even at the heart of this debate that people have sometimes is, like, if you go back to like basic math class, like, and I do statistics all the time, but I can't, so I should know the terms, but I'm blanking a little bit. But do you remember like the difference between, like, maybe you heard back in high school math about like nominal data or ordinal data or interval data, right? That there's multiple forms of data, And when I hear everybody say that, like, everybody now is a survivor, like when that's put out there, like this is the truth for everyone, it's kind of like taking one form of data and shoving it across the whole experience that many of us go through with cancer. And I think we need to recognize there's more of a developmental path to going through cancer. And to have language that matches along the way with those journeys.
So Adele has put into the chat about living well after a diagnosis of cancer. Anybody have any thoughts on that phrase, living well after a diagnosis of cancer?
What
Too
cancer?
many words.
Right with that. What is the cancer? Because she can be living very well with a minor squamous cell carcinoma, or like Jamie, living very well with stage 4 colorectal. And there isn't a disease called cancer. And I think, again, I'm going to blame the cancer societies for producing the anxiety. That is, the anxiety is high. So they, for instance, they got success about 2 decades ago. Howard may remember the exact date, for where they decided that anybody who's even been diagnosed with a cancer is a cancer survivor. And I think you can see amongst all of us here.
That was 1986.
1986. Okay, so that's a bizarre thing. We would have said that, earlier, that you were a cancer survivor just because you got diagnosed with it. But they pushed for that language, the war language, the survivor metaphor, the inability to distinguish one cancer from another. All of that makes them look good. They can claim that, look, there's so many more cancer survivors. But what are they saying? Well, if you listen to the definition, they're saying there's so many more cancer diagnoses, which is nothing to be particularly happy about. Other than the fact that we got diagnosed earlier when it may be treatable, the diseases, that is, in general. I think the question is a common is one that has to be, again, brought back to, what do you mean by that type of cancer?
So we got a fair amount of pushback in the chat window. I don't know if you saw it, Richard, about the use of your language regarding caregivers and the use of the patient partner. And what some people said was, well, your partner may not necessarily be your life partner and your sexual partner. What if the caregiver is a parent? Or what if the caregiver is a sibling or a child? I mean, where is that addressed in your language?
It could have been, it should have been, and the time I had, it wasn't. And I take it as a valid criticism. I was talking about simply dyadic adult cohabiting, common law, or married spouses. But it's absolutely true. There are certain situations where a parent is a caregiver, and that's absolutely got to be accepted as the correct language. But it is also one which recognizes that the power dynamic is one that's not necessarily balanced. I accept it. I spoke in a very limited way about the term caregiver, and certainly in certain situations, it is always the right term.
I had some input on that from one of my friends. So I was just going to say, one of my friends is listening in. Her name is Linda Holden. She's partner and caregiver to a man with metastatic breast cancer and has been for 16 and a half years. And she just, when she was listening, she let me know that it didn't sit well with her. So I asked her, I said, well, what do you prefer? How do you refer to yourself? And she said, sometimes more partner, other times caregiver, probably caregiver more. Bob is living with MBC for 16 and a half years, and rules have definitely changed. And so I think it's, somewhat fluid, at least for Linda, with respect to where she and her husband fall along those lines.
I would speak to that. It is, as I said, if there's a partnership, it's great if we can preserve the partnership. And then if we're talking about adults, pairs, couple, common dyads, spouses. I was speaking to the literature that's been published. There's Dr. Azer out of Harvard, who's published on the survival value of having a spouse. And that's he talks about it as a husband or wife, a spouse, and he doesn't talk about same-sex couples or anything like that. We don't have data on it. But the survival value of having a partner is fantastic compared to living without one. And that's why you notice on my slide I didn't said simply marriage counseling or dating service, because it's a tragedy as well for the patients often who are alone and don't have anybody to be a partner or a caregiver. I mean, that's a real tough situation. And I please get back to Linda. I apologize if she thought that I was being insensitive to her situation.
Oh, I don't think that. I just think I was just reading what she said so that we could learn from people who are currently experiencing what it is we're talking about.
Yeah, well, it's a transition from being a partner to a caregiver, which is a sad but unavoidable situation in many of our lives.
So I'm going to go to Len momentarily, who has a couple of questions that have been sent in. But I want to comment on Anita Mitchell's last comment in the chat window about palliative care, because it really strikes home with me. Anita says in there, for me, the language of cancer should change on the words that mean better treatment. If we want people to use palliative care, we have to change the name. Anita, I agree so much with that statement about palliative care. I've talked about it. I've talked about it with one of the most significant palliative care advocates in the country, B.J. Miller, who some of you may know, Dr. B.J. Miller, who's had 9 million views of his TED Talk, and who is on our advisory board, and with others who are in the palliative care service. And I mean, there are so many euphemisms. I know, for example, that UCSF uses symptom management service. And I feel that symptom management service is a much friendlier term than palliative care. And I'm sure some of you can come up with some of the other terms, but I feel that some of these words that we use have bad associations. And so if we can just come around those associations, we can encourage people that we support to avail themselves of services like palliative care much earlier in the disease process. Len, what questions do you have for the panel?
Right. I have two questions, Rick. One is from Rich saying, would it be more accurate to say living with cancer or living with the effects of treatment? I guess it depends on the individual case, but I open it to the panel.
Well, I've already said that it depends on the individual case, so that's my position on this. By the way, I mean, let me just go back to the last thing that Rick said, and that is that I do feel that the word palliative is dangerous. I also pointed out that the commonest chemical treatment for prostate cancer, androgen deprivation therapy, is technically palliative. I can also say that in the book, which discusses the whole book, androgen deprivation therapy, you will not find the word palliative. So I recognize the case for staying away from the term, and I've done that myself. Nobody who goes on ADT is told, I'm sorry, this is palliative, because so many people interpret that term to mean we've given up on anything curative. However, if the palliative treatment works for enough decades, there may in fact be better cures around. So symptom management is one, but I've also had a patient who had been misled. He knew he was going on androgen deprivation therapy and thought it was going to be curative, and was shocked that he did not know that when the doctor hadn't explained to him that it was not a curative treatment. So it's symptom management. That's most assuredly what it is, and maybe one more word that we need, but it's a better term than palliative as it's currently understood.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've seen so many people in my life that have resisted hospice because they thought it was a choice. They thought it was live or not live, and that by accepting hospice, it just meant that they were not willing to try a lot steeped in the language that we're talking tonight. But if you had something that was just symptom management, I can't imagine folks denying themselves of that.
Yeah, I've been wrestling with the right word to describe something between curative and palliative recently. I mean, what do you call that treatment where you know it's not going to be curative? You're not taking it just to alleviate a symptom, you're taking it to manage your disease. And
Here, Rick, I'm cutting in on you. It's called chronic disease management. We get to a situation in a lot of cancer patients, I guess I'm one of them, where you're on the treatment for so long, it's like managing blood pressure, managing diabetic risk. And to let people see it that way, I think is a valuable thing. But again, I'm biased by my own situation because I have had potentially metastatic cancer for almost 20 years. And I have to manage it as a chronic disease. So I think this is the concept that is coming in, chronic cancer management. And I see value in that, the idea of chronic cancer management.
I mean, I mean, that's what we know it is. It's managing the disease, but we don't have a good single word to go along with curative and palliative for it. Management. I mean, Corey, do you have any word that fits in that gap between palliative and curative?
I don't think you need something that fits in that gap. I think that calling it what it is completely reasonable, and you don't have to make a claim as to whether it's going to cure you or do nothing in terms of how it unfolds with respect to your surviving a particular cancer. I think it is exactly what it is. You are managing the symptoms of your disease.
And just to even
I think we need to stay away from whether or not we're like attaching it to mortality. I don't know that that's necessary.
Well, I like the word
yes,
manage.
go ahead, Jenny.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
I like the term management there because, like, for instance, again, kind of thinking, to my field of study, that, like, for instance, our master's program that I teach in is a degree that focuses on humanitarian and disaster management. But under that umbrella of management, you have prevention efforts, you have preparedness efforts, you have mitigation efforts, doing what you can to, keep the damage from getting worse. You have response, you have recovery, you have long-term recovery, and then sometimes there is no recovery, and you've got complex emergence, right? So it's this whole continuum, but it all falls under that word management. So I think that is a nice way of being able to kind of deal with it. And the other thing that kind of stood out to me as I've reflected on some of our conversation is that I think we also need to be thinking more about using and rather than or in the way that we talk about our experiences as a community as well. Not just that flexibility that, like, I think that you can be both a caregiver and a partner. Those don't have to be mutually exclusive. And that having that more and is going to allow us to capture the richness in describing our experiences.
Len, you had one more question for us.
Yes, I do. This one's from Peter. If death is natural, why is so much effort put into treating it as an unnatural part of life?
Okay, I'll take the lead on that. As a university professor, when I gave my last official lecture, I decided I would take on the greater philosophical questions. And I pointed out that at least it's been said by various philosophers and one dramatician. So Socrates says, the unexamined life is not worth living. Shakespeare says, to be or not to be, that is the question. And a third philosopher, Camus, said that the only important philosophical question is that of suicide. All of them are actually saying the same thing. That is, it's important to realize that one should be considering why they want to live. And unfortunately, we're running into a terribly odd situation. We've extended life expectancy by several decades in just about a century. As the healthcare between vaccines, antibiotics, sanitation has produced ability for us to live well past what we'd ever have lived if you go back to, say, biblical times. We didn't have to get old and weary. We just slowed down and a big cat ate us. If you go to the Bible, there is mention of lions 50 times. I mean, there's not a lot of mentions of natural old age and death. There are a few, but basically, there's far more mention of lions. We are facing an odd situation where we are living an exceptionally long time. And it comes back to asking why we're living. And there can be all sorts of answers: to care for others, to make it a better world. Everyone has an individual answer. But if you're going to say death is natural, and yes, it is, then you actually have to ask a question: so why keep living? And I think everybody in this panel decides that there's a reason worth living, and we plan to do it. And I think all of us hope that we're making it a better world for others. I stop there.
Anybody else want to answer Peter's question?
As a psychologist, my answer to those sorts of questions would be, Peter, what do you think about this, right? I pop out on that one. I did just want to acknowledge both with what Peter was asking, but also kind of using that as a springboard into just some of the conversations about like palliative care and even management that has sprung up by others here in the discussion box about, again, seeing that even when we talk about, like I was advocating for management, that there's some points that raise issues with that and that are very valid that I hadn't thought about. So, it's one of those things that I think we're, as a community, going to have to just keep grappling with how to talk about these things. And the other part is, even if we come up with what works for the whole community now, my guess is in 5 years or 10 years, we're going to have to restart up all of these same conversations. So like tonight, if we somehow solve this huge debate and we have the definitive answers and we all write this great book together, and it's, 5 years from now, it's going to be old, everybody's going to look back like, can you believe that those people thought that? That as research advances, our experiences advance, just even thinking about the word palliative, that if we change it, which I also agree, like I would rather hear that named something else, but whatever we name it, eventually we're all going to start having the same association with whatever we replace it with. Now, it's going to be a while down the road, but these things are going to keep evolving.
We just need to keep in front of it, like antibiotic resistance. That's all.
Right.
The only thing I would add to this conversation is that I feel, and again, I'm talking through my own narrow perspective, that in our society, at least from the sliver that I see, we have sterilized ourselves from both like birth and death. We don't talk about it. We don't experience it. It's all done somewhere else. I was raised in a house where I had 4 people live and die with us, my grandparents and one of my great aunts. And so from a very young age, I experienced death, and we talked about it, and it was just part of life. And it was a natural process that happened to each of us. And I learned then, when I was, 8 years old, that I better live it right now, because I see what's happening at the end of this whole thing. I don't think a lot of people have that experience. We don't live in extended families anymore. And I think that could be contributing to why it is so difficult for us to even have these conversations in the first place.
Absolutely.
So what I'd like to do is just circle around the panel one last time for any closing thoughts or any additional closing comments. Howard, you've been so silent tonight.
Well, I mean, you're all sitting in a land that seems far, far away for me as somebody on active surveillance. I mean, I like to call it sort of like the Seinfeld of cancers. It's a disease about nothing. There's no real treatment. There's just the diagnostics. So you talk about all this palliative stuff. I just have to listen hard, and my hope is that I don't get there to cope with that. And then if you ask big questions about death, I suppose all of us can answer that or not answer that. And I'm in a much more upbeat mood now, and I have no answers. just living a day at a time with my cancer.
Very good. I like that. Jamie, what are your closing thoughts?
You know, hearing some of the debate on like the language that we use, one that wasn't talked about but was something that was really a personal struggle for me, was around the word resilience. You know, so my whole career, I've spent my career empirically studying resilience in disaster zones and humanitarian hotspots. And kind of a lay definition of resilience is, if you kind of think of taking a beach ball and putting it underwater and then it bouncing back, right? That's kind of like a lay common definition, or the ability to adapt. And I remember having a lot of people tell me when I was going through my treatments and when I was really struggling so much, that they would say things like, you know, we appreciate, you know, the example of resilience that you're being, or you're so resilient. And I remember saying, no, actually, you know, I know what that definition of resilience is, and that doesn't feel like it fits me. Or what I'm going through, that I had to, you know, I had to even turn taking a nap into active resting, you know, because I felt like everything was happening to me. So I had to find ways to be more proactive. And I struggled with that. And then I also lost several friends to cancer after I started doing better. And their bodies were never given the opportunity to bounce back from the disease. And so for me personally, I spent a couple of years really researching and digging into philosophy and different writings, and really landed on the term fortitude, which is, you know, if you kind of go back, you know, to even some ancient language of looking at that being considered really kind of the virtue of adversity, and more about endurance, not always about overcoming. And I think it would do us well to be able to learn language that has both an overcoming perspective, but also about what does it mean to still live if we don't actually overcome the disease, and to live even in suffering. And so we did a study where we've been able to validate a measure of fortitude to show that it's different from resilience and grit statistically. But again, this is not me saying throw resilience out the window, because I'm still all for that. But again, we just need more nuanced ways of talking, and more nuanced ways of talking amongst ourselves.
So I love the beach ball with resilience. I really get it. But what simile are we going to use for fortitude?
I'm not sure. So that's you'll have to let me know. I haven't gotten that far. So our best analogy right now is that it's like a metabolism analogy, that it helps us metabolize our suffering so that we can keep living. But I don't have a beach ball one. Only in my own experience it was more like a flattened beach ball for several years.
So I just want to comment on one thing in the chat window that Mr. Jackson just put in there, because I think it's very astute. He says the problem with having a discussion about death is it is so hard to find an authoritative source for the other side. He's right. Professor Dr. Wasasu, I can't say professor. Dr. Wasasu, what are your closing thoughts?
I think the commonality of all of us here on the screen, as pictures I can see, including my own, is that we all realize that language means something, and language itself can affect how we deal with our life, how we feel about our situation and our health. And I'm intrigued by the attention that we gave, and I hope that people listening in will take the time just to think about what that word meant, or whatever that word was that they had just heard or just spoken. Because I do think we've confirmed, at least to me, as I've seen this, that yeah, this stuff is worth thinking about. And I feel very honored to have been invited. I want to thank everybody who was willing to listen in. And I know that not everybody agreed with everything I said, but they have my email address, and I will be happy to try to correspond further if people wish. So thank you for letting me be here.
Thank you, Richard. Kari, I'll give you the final word.
Well, I couldn't agree more with what everybody said in their closing remarks. Jamie, I in particular really appreciate your diligence in trying to find alternative words. I like fortitude a lot. I think a lot of people would find that it resonates if you could find something that can encompass this notion that it's not something that happened once in a discrete way in the past and now we're through it and everything is good. If there was some way to talk about it and find other words that did resonate. I think I'll leave it to you and other experts to try to help the rest of us navigate. And I just want to leave a couple other things that are put on the table, a couple other things that we didn't quite get to, which is the notion that we have to be positive, or thought to have been positive through these experiences. And I got this, like you were saying, you got resilience was something that people attributed to you. And I get a lot of just think positively, you're being positive, smile, you have to be basically kind of some happy cheerleader as you go through cancer in order to be some role model to other people. And it puts a lot of pressure for you to not kind of break down when you're in the grocery store and somebody has parked their cart sideways in the aisle and is blocking you, and you just want to kind of go off on it. So I just want to say, when you get a diagnosis of cancer, it doesn't put you on a pedestal that makes you have to act or be different than who you ever were, and that there's a lot of the language that we haven't quite talked about tonight that tries to force people into being some sort of otherworldly person as a result of their diagnosis. And I also appreciate being here. Thank you.
It's our pleasure to have all of you, Corey and Jamie and Richard and Howard. And I invite all of you, if you feel like writing any or any other blog, some of these other words and phrases that are on your mind, Corey, let's get them out there. So I just want to thank you again, not just the panel, but everybody who listened in. I want to urge you to go to the ANCAN website and see if there are any resources there that you can avail yourself of if you're not already on our list. A breast cancer group, our male breast cancer group, et cetera, et cetera. I also want to say that we did record this, and it will get posted on the website. If you go to the blogs and go to recordings and go to the recordings category, you'll find it there probably sometime tomorrow, and it will be there. It's also on our YouTube channel. So if you want to refer anyone else who couldn't make the live group to that, they'll be able to participate in the wisdom of the group. And with that, I say thank you to everybody and good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you, panel.
Good night. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night. Good night.